Not long after initial contact, the Terrans sent the CSS Helios through their gate and sealed off Sol from the Stellar Federation. No one beyond the humans' home system considered the threat to be serious. Not a single species in recorded history had managed to keep the agents of civilization at bay. Their amusement swiftly changed to dread when the initial merchant vessel ignored the quarantine. The solar fleet immediately boarded the ship, extracted their crew, and sent them back through the gate devoid of all electronic devices. They even disabled the Felinar captain's electronic eye. The compact objected, yet the Terrans remained firm. All interactions with the humans and their associates would take place beyond Sol. No exemptions were allowed. Thus, the Galactics hauled their own space station through the gate and positioned it next to the Apollo. The cosmic nexus, more than triple the size of the Terrans' repurposed diplomatic structure, boasted a sleek hull teeming with compact diplomats, merchants, and inquisitive spectators. Its corridors were packed with eateries and stores, overwhelming visitors with the marvels of the galaxy. The handful of humans who came across it found the attempt amusingly obvious. It quickly gained the nickname Nebula Hub. "They're all looking," grumbled Lieutenant Frost as he took a sip of his frustratingly alcohol-free beverage. "Even the blasted bartender." "That's because you're one of just 2 humans in the room," remarked Captain Swiftwing Gliding Breeze, known to pals as Chirp. "And since this isn't a bar, and he's not the bartender, the proper terms are diner and cook." "It's essentially a bar. Same clientele, same greasy food, same lousy music. You still won't find any of your favorite poisons in here." "Doesn't seem quite right that we're the sole species who consume the stuff," remarked Lieutenant Hawkins. "Makes us face this galactic hellhole without a buzz, without a—" The trio of naval officers had been dispatched to Nebula Hub with dual purposes. The diplomatic corps had believed the compact might be swayed by 3 of Solar Fleet's most distinguished officers, and the Admiralty Board had desired some unofficial muscle, present in case the negotiations turned sour. It wasn't particularly significant that only 2 of them were combat personnel, or that none had served in the same unit for over 3 years. They were primarily there as representations. So now a pair of bored humans and 1 unimpressed aviar were whiling away the hours in a Xyloth-owned diner, stripped of weapons and armor except for 3 small concealable pistols. Somewhere on the station, a team of human legal experts were warding off the compact bureaucracy's latest attempt to reclaim the RAM, but the soldiers weren't paying much heed to that. They were occupied with being bored. At the very least, the Galactics consumed some intriguing cuisine. The diminutive Xyloth chef started bringing out a constant flow of unusual dishes for the dinner guests, and the Terrans quickly found themselves amazed by the assortment of meals. Well, Jenkins certainly was. Slater was mainly just listening, while Chirp occupied himself with an old human book. The pair of humans turned expectantly as the Xyloth emerged from his kitchen, carrying another platter. "Giant space turkey?" suggested Jenkins. "Too darn big to be chicken. Perhaps some sort of—" "Hey, Chirp," Slater interjected, interrupting Jenkins. "The Galactics don't still consume you folks, do they?" The bird-like creature didn't bother looking up from his book. "Is Vacrothnai available on the menu? If that's the case, then yes. We're also used as the filling for a couple of the more well-liked Xyloth pies." "Screw that," growled Slater. The muscular rescue tech stood up from his chair and began moving towards where a pair of enormous Goliath were beginning to rip into the roasted aviar. Chirp's head jerked up from his book. He'd heard that tone previously, on videos from Novaran. "What do you suppose you're going to do?" "Solve our problem. What if it gets violent? Diplomatic immunity. You'll find about as much of that around here as you'll find alcohol. The compact doesn't offer diplomatic immunity." Slater paused. "Wait, really?" "Yes. Stepping on toes in here isn't really a good idea." "I'll try be gentle then." With that, he strode off. Gentle, though the aviar. That'd be a first. Goliath are enormous. Standing 8 feet tall, they move about on 4 powerful legs at a slow, deliberate pace. They're among the rare species in compact space that develop language and culture without utilizing tools, instead depending on their basic traps and ambushes to drive brain growth. It was evident. Slater bent over their table and practically spat in their faces. "You might not want to eat that." The bigger one of the two gazed at the human, then uttered in a low growl. The Terran translation devices dutifully notified their users that the creature was upset. "What's it to you?" "You're eating a friend of mine." "Food's food. Now scurry off." "No." The Goliath growled and fell back on the aggression his kind was known for. He swung at the human, but Slater nimbly avoided the strike. Then he shattered the giant's legs with 4 swift, precise kicks and moved aside as his massive foe crashed to the ground with a thud. The other Goliath retreated at once. "Have it. Just leave. Doesn't taste good anyway." Slater grunted his approval and lifted the carcass off the table. The Xyloth proprietor hurried over to his side before he could make his way back to his fellow Terrans. "Does the menu give you cause for violence and offense?" "Yeah. Quit putting Terrans on your menu. Next time I catch you cooking one of us, I'll slice you open myself." Jenkins and Chirp had already settled their bill and gotten up from their seats. The trio of Terrans exited the diner without a word. Then Jenkins broke the silence. "Hey, Slater." "Yeah? What precisely are we supposed to do with a partially consumed deep-fried aviar?" Speckled crest-curved beak longed intensely to escape the stress-laden galactic courtroom, but he'd found himself unable to refuse that confounded human lawyer. He hadn't pressured Mottled, quite the opposite. If they had, the small aviar could have likely resisted them using some of the techniques he'd learned from companions like Hope and Volkov. Instead, they'd merely requested, and the human's sincere remorse at being unable to put himself in harm's way had convinced the ambassador. With Mottled now having a front-row seat at the hearings, he couldn't help but recall the atmosphere on the Indomitable's bridge just before the First Battle of Sol. The courtroom felt all too reminiscent. The reptilian Serpentis had leveraged their status as the galaxy's finest attorneys to become one of the most influential species in the compact. The humans had nearly annihilated it within the course of a single morning. They accomplished this on live television, no less. All compact trials were aired freely in the name of transparency. Human lawyers hadn't allowed the compact lawyers to complete a sentence for the initial 20 minutes of the trial. They'd appeared to take pleasure in countless requests for clarification or in raising objections to potentially biased wordings. The unfortunate Murid lawyer assigned to the plaintiff's opening statements had nearly gnawed off his arm the third time. A human politely asked that he refrain from implying that inanimate objects might transcend their physical purpose and existence to assume qualities of a metaphysical soul, lest he offend the deeply spiritual and influential Aether. As the Serpentis at last relinquished the floor, having consumed 2 hours to finish 15 minutes worth of proceedings, their previously tranquil and placid expressions had given way to angry hissings and quickly flicking tails. The humans had scarcely begun. An elderly human stood and began to speak. "Your Honor," he stated, inclining his head at the judge, "it is my distinct honor to speak before the court and counter the Stellar Federation's assertion regarding the former GCS RAM. Our position is rather straightforward. We dispute the Compact's assertion that the Vorn incursion into Terran space was, in reality, the unauthorized action of deserters and renegades. We instead argue that the attack was an official Compact operation and, as such, fully subject to the laws of war. The GCS RAM is therefore legitimate Terran salvage, a fact we aim to demonstrate by drawing upon the extensive and notable case history of this court." She sat down as the courtroom fell quiet. No one dared to question the completely corrupt Compact legal system, a system so flawed that judges and attorneys came from the same group of Serpentis. Not a single person had ever emerged victorious on the Compact's own ground. The humans weren't particularly concerned about victory, however. They had an entirely different objective in mind. The other human attorney, a considerably younger man, rose and started to speak in a steady, distinct tone. It took a moment for the Compact delegates to grasp what was happening, but when they did, every Murid present became paralyzed with astonishment. The attorney proceeded through an extensive catalog of horrors, rattling them off at such a pace that the shocked Murid could only protest against a handful. The majority simply stared in dismay as the humans exposed the Compact's shameful secrets to the whole galaxy. The list was quite extensive. The silent eradication of the peaceful Lumina, justified by Compact representatives as a lawful extension of the Quartzoid's mining privileges. a centuries-old ruling that had enabled the compact Navy to absorb dozens of Felinar warships after their environmental systems experienced catastrophic failures. Numerous conflicting verdicts issued to various allies and adversaries of the Murid were presented as proof of the court's inability to properly define the fundamental laws of space and the enigmatic annihilation of hundreds of newly contacted species who coincidentally inhabited mineral-rich systems. Even the human suspicions of council involvement in the obliteration of the Novaran sun were brought up, reinforcing the humans' narrative of compact oppression and despotism. The tidy-looking attorney would have continued for hours if not for the unfortunate malfunction of the broadcast system. After the compact court officials reluctantly accepted a quick offer of assistance from a conveniently located human technician, the hearing resumed. The human's argument, however, did not. The court believes that continuing their previous line of inquiry would merely disadvantage the defendants, the judge clarified with feigned sincerity. The court therefore yields the floor to the plaintiffs. The Murid attorneys, still trapped somewhere between disbelief and fury, sputtered out something unintelligible about a pirate takeover and protocol among nations, then yielded the floor. The judge grudgingly returned his attention to the humans. "Call forth your chief witness." The aging attorney nodded and motioned towards Mottled. "We'd like to summon the AVR speckled crest curved beak." Aloud, Mottled rose from his chair and walked towards the witness stand. He hadn't felt this frightened in years, not since the Indomitable's hull had cracked after a glancing grav lance hit. Why'd he have to agree to be the lure? He sat down and turned to face the human lawyer. She spoke. "Speckled crest curved beak, were you in attendance during the Vorn invasion of what was at that time Human Alliance territory?" "Yes, I was." "What was your role in the battle?" "I served as a civilian observer." "Thank you," she faced the judge. "In light of these initial questions, Your Honor, I would like to request that any additional testimony from Speckled Crest Curved Beak be recorded in the records as that of an unbiased observer." One of the Serpentis stood up at once. "Objection! AVR battled side by side with humans during the conflict." "If I may, Your Honor." The judge nodded resignedly at the human. "Thank you. I shouldn't need to remind the court that the AVR, having no government acknowledged by the Stellar Federation, cannot be legally bound to other AVR except through a military chain of command. As Speckled Crest Curved Beak was entirely outside the military command during the battle, he cannot be grouped with the AVR who served alongside human crews. He is therefore impartial and independent." The judge sighed. "Very well. Overruled." "Thank you, Your Honor." The human attorney had scarcely turned back towards Mottled when another Murid lawyer sprang up, his face contorted into a fierce grimace. "Objection, Your Honor, due to the rationale behind the AVR's absence of an acknowledged government. The Stellar Federation does not, as a matter of fact, recognize them as a species with complete sophonts, rendering any testimony this being might provide inadmissible. The humans are unable to utilize an AVR as a witness." The judge faced the human once more. "Does the Terran delegation have a response to offer?" The attorney nodded, mirroring the Murid's smug expression with a predatory smile of her own. "We are able to, Your Honor, given the significance of our key witness, and under the relevant expansion clauses of Statutes 14b and 283(6)c, the Terran Alliance wishes to broaden the scope of these hearings. We therefore propose a motion for the compact to officially recognize AVR sentience to the fullest degree, including all provisions for retroactive indemnities and prosecution for crimes against the species, and formally incorporate it into the proceedings." Her smile remained unwavering as she took her seat. "That is all." The courtroom erupted into disorder. Mottled and the human legal team slumped with relief as their strategy succeeded, and aliens throughout the galaxy shifted their attention towards Sol, fascinated by the audacity of the small, independent Terran Alliance. They'd just gotten a lot more dangerous. Slater was adamant about burying the AVR corpse, so the three soldiers negotiated their way onto the SAD's Invincible and laid it to rest with complete military honors. Jenkins even succeeded in locating a Terran flag to cover the casket. Chirp found the gesture strangely moving. "That's why we'll chase these bastards all the way to hell," he mused. "They truly give a damn." The hunt for a flag had also yielded a few cans of light beer. Instead of enduring another afternoon aboard Nebula Hub, the group concealed themselves in a partially vacant cargo bay and circulated the alcohol. Even the aviar served himself a greatly diluted drink and ventured a taste. "Gah!" he gagged. "That's strong." Jenkins regarded him with suspicion. "That's a thimble of beer and a liter of water. It couldn't possibly burn." "No liver. My body responds as expected." He stopped briefly to swallow another sip. "It's not made any better by the fact that this stuff is essentially poison, either." "What's the point, then?" asked Slater. The ERT hadn't sipped his beverage. Chirp shrugged. "Seems to fit the mood." "Amen to that," murmured Jenkins. He drained his can and reached for another. They sat in silence for a while. Then Slater spoke. "Hey, Chirp," he said, his tone grave. "What became of the aviar that didn't flee with the remainder of the remnant flock? Breeding colonies. We're the ideal livestock. They can place us in a factory, simmer us with the soup, or toss us in a cage and force us to sing. The Vorn export us by the millions. It doesn't help that some murid marketers succeeded in making us nearly as common as chicken a few centuries ago, either." Slater trembled. "How come more of you don't attempt to escape? I don't believe I've ever heard about any runaways." "Escaping isn't really a possibility. You all recall that Tridax merchant vessel we seized a couple of years ago?" Slater gave a nod. "Those bastards figured they'd be secure in Terran territory with slaves on their ship. Weren't you leading the initial boarding party that went across?" "Yeah, removed the 3 aviar myself. It took us months to get them off the mix of drugs the Tridax had been giving them, and we're still working on removing their kill switches. Can you picture trying to do that for 10 million aviar all at once?" Jenkins chuckled. "Sounds like a fun challenge." "A challenge that could potentially stretch your race too thin," Chirp considered. He kept his doubts to himself, however. There were other issues to address. "It's a moot point, however, because a large portion of the galaxy operates using so-called intelligent, non-sentient slaves such as ourselves. The aviar are merely the most recent primitive species sacrificed for this purpose. Without our kind, the compact would crumble. The Felinar civilization relies on slaves to prevent its downfall. I suspect a Murid hasn't performed any genuine labor in thousands of years. They've constructed their empire through the exploitation of slave labor. The Tridax trading fleet, the Vorn privateer squadrons, and even portions of the compact navy require as many slaves as they do crew members. Many of the more prosperous shipyards and mines also increase their profits by endangering so-called non-sentients instead of skilled workers or costly machinery as well. All of it's perfectly legal, naturally. Intelligent non-sentients such as ourselves have about as much protection as a stone, and not a single influential species desires that to change." Slater broke in. "So why not tear it all down?" Chirp blinked his 4 eyes in surprise. "Wait, what?" "Surely you've heard the rumors. The Admiralty's been preparing for an offensive against the Compact since before they dispatched the Ram." "Sure, but the Compact consists of hundreds of species and thousands of planets. Not even you could eliminate something of that magnitude." Jenkins chuckled. "You clearly haven't learned much about our history. It doesn't matter whether it takes 10 years or 10 centuries. We're capable of defeating the Compact." The Marine went on, clearly enthused by the idea. "Everyone out there assumes we'll follow their playbook. Sweep in with superior force, overpower the defenders, then occupy the orbital facilities and population until a larger fleet arrives and eliminates you. They're battling for dominance, not annihilation, and it's evident. No attacking fleet has demolished a shipyard or mining installation in hundreds of years. We're not planning to play by the rules. We have hundreds of diplomatic vessels and merchant ships working to undermine Compact control on dozens of crucial worlds. There are entire squadrons of cruisers specifically designed for hit-and-run strikes against vital industries. And we're more than ready to target your leaders directly." He smiled. "The Unification War taught us everything we needed to know about toppling governments. But if you don't succeed, they'll destroy you." Chirp seemed somewhat taken aback by Jenkins' intensity. "You might just as well allow them to continue disregarding you." "Sure, but how long can that last?" The Marine scowled at the stack of empty cans resting between the three soldiers. Plus, our council's been quite set on damaging the compact for their actions against the AVR. Firebombing Askra practically ensured a war would happen. Any additional warmongering was interrupted by a loud whoop from somewhere aboard the ship. At some point on the vessel, the trial broadcast volume was turned up. Propose a motion for the compact to officially acknowledge AVR sentience in its entirety, encompassing all provisions for retroactive compensation and legal action regarding offenses against the species, and formally incorporate it into... Chirp emitted an admiring whistle as the broadcast ended. That's bold. Slater wasn't nearly as familiar with intergalactic politics as his two companions. Isn't that merely symbolic? The AVR shook his head. No way. If they manage to push that through, and there's a chance they might, the compact would retroactively owe us around 9 centuries' worth of indemnities and prosecutions. It'd be messy, to put it mildly. Well, damn. The ERT leaned back. That is gutsy. Jenkins' communicator emitted a sharp beep. The Marine looked at it and scowled. It seems they've discovered a task for us to handle after all. We're supposed to go down to the courtroom and accompany a particular speckled crest curved beak back to the better than you. His handler's growing anxious and is requesting some additional support. No security grunts to do their dirty work? Are you kidding? Compact would go nuts if we brought more than a few, and the majority of them are protecting our expensive legal team. Modeled's just fallen into our lap now. Well, let's hope we don't need to fire at anything. Slater raised his holdout pistol, tiny enough that it could vanish into his palm. Couldn't intimidate a chunk of cheese with this worthless thing. Chirp had been prodding at the large crate they'd been utilizing as a table. He emitted an enthusiastic little hoot as it suddenly opened to reveal what was inside. Within were numerous sets of low-profile body armor, designed for both AVR and humans, alongside dozens of the newest Terran-manufactured pulse rifles and pistols. The armaments were sufficient to equip a small platoon. "Hey, everyone," the AVR said, carefully raising one of the menacing-looking rifles. "Check out what I discovered." Modeled shifted uneasily as he awaited his escort back to the Terran diplomatic vessel. The Nebula Hub's broad corridors appeared rather intimidating now that he'd ruffled his feathers for all the galaxy to witness. A pair of well-armed Felinar were softly conversing just along the corridor. Standing 7 feet in height, the slender and wolf-like bipedal creatures loomed over the nearby aliens. The small AVR felt uneasy about the intense focus they were directing at him. Other passers-by also took notice of Modeled. A small group of Serpentis stopped to glare at him, each of them hissing angrily before continuing their walk. A Goliath on some kind of hover cart, his 4 massive legs heavily bandaged, stared at the AVR with hostility and fear. A passing cluster of quartzoid servant bugs broke from their typical indifference and observed the ambassador. Some mantis, dressed in their customary military finery, even went so far as to pull out a recording device and point it at the trembling avian. Not all of the stares were hostile. An amphibious amphibos bubbled a quick encouragement, his words coming so rapidly that Modeled's translator nearly couldn't decipher them, before hurrying away. He was followed by an equally nervous ether, who expressed his personal yet entirely unofficial, naturally, support for the Terran's cause. Familiar faces were scarce and scattered, however, and Modeled breathed a sigh of relief when his trio of escorts came into view. Slater and Jenkins, readily identifiable from the news broadcasts, were clad in civilian attire, while their diminutive AVR companion wore unpowered body armor. Each of the three carried a black duffel bag slung across their shoulder. The pocket of vacant corridor that had formed around them reached Modeled before the Terrans arrived. The open space allowed him to discern their discussion. "So why do the birds get body armor while we don't?" complained Jenkins, the shorter of the two humans. "This button-down won't stop anything." "We're wearing armor," responded Chirp, "because no one has ever been frightened by an aviar. Your combat attire, however, makes you appear more like a mobile fortress than an infantry soldier. There would be chaos. I'd still feel better wearing something a little more substantial." "I know, it's great." The three became quiet as they stopped in front of Modeled. Chirp began to speak once more. "Senior Ambassador Speckled Crest Curved Beak?" Mottled gave a nod. "We've been tasked with escorting you back to the better than you. Slater here's brought some armor for you. We're going to need to request that you put it on before we leave." "Do you expect us to be attacked before we make it back to the ship?" The AVR warrior shrugged. "Who can say? I've been picking up paranoia from the experts, though, and at this moment, every single one of those lessons is urging me to get off this crate as fast as possible. I wouldn't feel secure without a layer of nano-weave separating you from everything else." "Wonderful," Mottled mused as he donned the lightweight armor. "I'm about to be shot at once more." After the ambassador was securely settled, the 4 Terrans made their way back to the vessel. Slater took the lead while Jenkins covered the rear. Mottled and Chirp walked alongside each other in between. The ambassador was taken aback by the apparent weight of the soldiers' duffel bags. "What's inside those?" he inquired, motioning towards Chirp's cargo with a feather tip. The AVR's crest quivered with embarrassment. "Just some, toys we, discovered. They shouldn't be an issue." "Shouldn't?" Jenkins' face split into a feral grin. "If we open up the bags, you'll be quite pleased we brought them along." Mottled was nearly taken aback when Slater chimed in next. The brawny ERT hadn't participated in the discussion with his fellow team members. "Here, take this," he said, passing the ambassador an AVR-sized helmet. "It'll show you the path back to the ship. Use it if we happen to get separated." Mottled put the helmet on. The HUD displayed nothing except a rotating map of the station. "Don't you all need these?" "We've got our monocles," Jenkins remarked, gesturing at a barely visible lens hovering above his right eye. "Our respected captain decided that helmets might be a bit too daunting." "I was correct as well," said Chirp. "You nearly sent that poor little Tridax into a state of shock." Jenkins shrugged. "Not my fault she came flying around that corner so quickly. I simply responded." "That's the issue," grumbled Slater. "You responded." They proceeded in silence until Mottled inadvertently activated his helmet's complete combat display. The aviator released a surprised squawk as data flooded his senses. Numerous viewports appeared, providing him a complete 360-degree view, and an equally overwhelming array of readouts displayed everything from his armor's condition to his location on the battle grid, to Chirp's relative position and vital signs. He might have collided with the wall if Slater hadn't seized him. "My apologies there, pal. I should have turned that off entirely." The human removed the helmet and tinkered with it briefly. Then he passed it back. "There you go. It shouldn't occur again." Mottled gave a faint nod and the group set off once more. The chatter picked up again, but the ambassador's focus shifted to a tiny column of text in the lower right corner of his HUD. It was moving swiftly upwards. Slater. "Are our Felinar tails still following us?" Chirp. "Affirmative. Both ours from the BTU and the ambassadors." Jenkins. "They're maintaining their distance?" Slater. "At the moment, I've got the pair in front." Chirp. I'm on lookout duty." Jenkins. "I can handle the 3 behind us." Chirp. Don't miss your shot." It took Mottled a moment to grasp the situation. The soldiers, engaging in a casual verbal conversation as they walked, were utilizing their pauses to subvocalize tactical information. The ambassador was impressed by this. They proceeded in that manner for some time, with the soldiers casually conversing while Mottled crept along between them. They had just succeeded in engaging Slater in a conversation about the cliffside flat Chirp had recently purchased on Venus when the gunfight erupted. Chirp pushed Mottled to the ground as each human drew, aimed, and discharged their compact handguns in one smooth movement. Jenkins eliminated the swiftest of his 3 targets with a headshot, then discarded his pistol in favor of a deadly pulse rifle he pulled from his duffel. The other 2 attackers fell under a barrage of automatic fire. Slater, a rescue technician by profession, wasn't quite as quick. His initial target took a hit to the stomach and collapsed, but the second Felinar had enough time to aim his rifle at Mottled. Chirp fired off a shot from where he was sprawled over the ambassador, but the angle was poor and it missed by a hair's width. Mottled tried frantically to recall if his armor could withstand a pulsar round. He needn't have worried. Slater swiftly knocked the pistol from his hand and into the Felinar's head, forcefully jerking its head backward. The lupine fell to the ground. "Hey, Slater," Chirp inquired as he dismounted from the ambassador. "I know you're a professional and everything. and I wouldn't dare question your judgment. But why in the world didn't you shoot him with one of the firearms we brought along?" The huge human shrugged. "Zipper got nabbed and the holdout was going through its cycle. Didn't leave me many choices." "Well, thanks, that would have been some painful paperwork." Mottled grimaced as he lifted himself from the ground. "Would anyone care to explain what just occurred?" "Case B3, displayed at the top of your HUD," Chirp remarked as he retrieved his own pulsar rifle from a bag, "indicates the Compact has just declared war on the Terran Alliance." "They did what?" Mottled's voice was shrill with surprise. "Declared war. Now, if you don't mind, I'd really prefer to get you back to the vessel before the actual combat begins." Mottled paused. "That wasn't the real fighting?" "That was amateur hour. Real thing's going to be a lot messier." Jenkins chimed in with another of his cruel grins. "Let's just say we've got plans for good old Lotus. The Compact isn't getting their space station back without a struggle." The Compact had expended a vast amount of resources in an effort to restrict the Terran military presence aboard Nebula Hub. Although they had minimal control over the official Terran delegations, they had meticulously screened every other visitor for active military service and disqualified anyone they deemed threatening. By the time they began issuing visitation passes, the galactic bureaucrats had persuaded themselves they'd allowed only artists, craftsmen, and merchants on board, while keeping the more dangerous human soldier cast at a distance. They were utterly mistaken. Humans had been readying themselves for the gate's appearance for 9 decades. The phrase, human civilian, was now confined to ancient jests and historical texts. All humans were trained in combat. Educational institutions taught fieldcraft and small unit tactics alongside math and biology, and every grown-up completed a 4-year stint in one of the uniformed services. No one was compelled to fight. The million-strong crew of the TAS Hephaestus, humanity's largest shipyard, consisted entirely of Navy personnel, but every man and woman in Seoul had been preparing for the worst since elementary school. The sheer quantity of troops the Terran armed forces maintained on active duty and in reserve was astounding. As a result, the Admiralty's main challenge in locating operatives to station aboard the Nebula Hub wasn't a shortage of volunteers. Instead, it was a lack of personnel to sift through the flood of applications. Consequently, each of the harmless and influential tourists the Compact approved for boarding Nebula Hub possessed at least 10 years of military experience. Chief Warrant Officer John Calloway was among those tourists. The Compact believed he was visiting on a lengthy journey in search of new inspiration for his prize-winning poetry. They hadn't the slightest inkling that the modest writer commanded the Lotus Vanguard's 9th Squad. He was taking a sip of his flavorless, artificial coffee when the conflict erupted. The man didn't even flinch as a tiny computer, its output linked directly to his optic nerve, displayed 2 words in his field of view. B3, Alpha. Plan Alpha, mused the poet. Relieved we don't have to explode this rat trap after all. He drained his coffee and gazed at a nearly blank notepad as, elsewhere on the vessel, his team began to mobilize. Their communication network was virtually undetectable, blending into the ambient noise and vibrations of the station. Yet the channel stayed quiet. Radio discipline was a deeply rooted characteristic in the militarized human species. Calloway endured 7 agonizing minutes. Then he stood and walked purposefully toward a restricted bulkhead, watched over by a grumpy-looking Tridax. The 3-legged alien contorted his mouth into a grotesque approximation of a smile and allowed the poet to pass. The poet had bribed the guard weeks earlier, stating that the noise and rumble of the station's maintenance corridors aided his concentration. The Tridax, likely instructed to accommodate the human artists, had eagerly accepted the money. That had resolved 9th Squad's initial obstacle. The next appeared soon after, a security bulkhead. The heavy door sealed off the more vital areas of the station: life support, defense systems, security offices, and the anti-plants. In place of a live guard, a set of biometric tests stood watch over this passageway. It slid open with a hiss as Calloway approached, the numerous alarms quiet. A human technician had guided him through the intricate bypass the first occasion he'd persuaded his way past the guard. The cameras monitoring the adjacent corridor had been more challenging. Without access to the secure camera system, 9th Squad had to devise a more inventive approach. The poet blinked thrice in quick succession, sending a lone click across his squad's comm network. Several minutes later, he got 2 clicks in response. Lyra's distraction had begun. She had devoted most of the past month to creating psychological profiles on all prominent Felinar, who regularly visited Station Level 9. She had narrowed the list down to the 20 most aggressive individuals, marking each with a tiny, almost imperceptible tracking beacon. Then she had dispatched 8 of 9th Squad's 14 members to harass them, with instructions to make their lives unbearable. It had worked splendidly. Calloway grinned at the idea of Sergeant Lyra, a petite vocalist from some avant-garde post-futurist rock band, starting a brawl with a 7-foot werewolf. It was the most fragile part of their scheme. The Felinar were experts, but the humans hoped that the guards wouldn't be paying too much attention to the cameras monitoring the final approach. Why watch your doorstep when there were humans causing trouble on your level? The poet dashed down the 200-meter hallway, traversing the length in 22 seconds, and halted outside the door to listen for any indication that the guards had noticed his arrival. There were none. Permitting himself a quick smile, Calloway pulled out 3 carbon-bladed knives. A pair were small and precisely balanced, while the third had a blade as long as his forearm. He then opened the door using a stolen key card and rushed in. His HUD flickered to life as he swept the room. The supervisor, critical points illuminated as it lunged frantically for an alarm switch, collapsed when one of Calloway's smaller blades found its way through a vulnerable neck joint. Another Felinar caught a knife in the throat moments later, his weapon scarcely halfway drawn from its holster. The last 2 guards had barely started to look away from the display on their monitors when the poet got to them. His extended blade gleamed once, then again, and both fell to the ground. Calloway grinned as he ended radio silence. "This is Calloway of 9th Squad. We're in." The Marines aboard the SAS Phantom erupted in cheers as Calloway's announcement echoed through the stealth vessel's speakers. They had been confined to the cramped zero-gravity troopship for the last month, and tensions were beginning to escalate. The flight crew barely noticed. They were occupied with maneuvering the stealthy Wraith-class corvette into position. Even the highly praised human stealth technology was unable to conceal the characteristic space-time ripples produced by matter annihilation plants, grav drives, and the inertial dampeners required to utilize a modern starship's Delta V. A Wraith was therefore engineered to surprise, rather than to conceal, waiting at a distance before activating its massive drive core. One squadron of the compact corvettes had been covertly transported through the gate and positioned beyond the Nebula Hub's detection range. Subsequently, they deactivated all galactic technology, depending instead on a human-made fusion reactor, and bided their time. 13 minutes earlier, when the compact had initiated hostilities by dispatching a fleet of battleships through the gate, they had activated their anti-plants. All of the galactic warships had swiftly detonated. A Terran reconnaissance vessel, masquerading as one of the numerous Sol-based merchant ships now traversing the stars, had marked them shortly after their arrival for exercises, and another disguised commercial craft had deployed a few dozen EVA troopers to attach small nuclear mines to the ships. But the message was unmistakable. War had begun. Calloway's message signaled that they could participate. Not one of the Marines aboard the Casper took the time to secure themselves. Should the inertial dampeners malfunction, they'd be reduced to pulp whether or not they were in a crash seat. The corvettes surged ahead, reaching a considerable fraction of light speed before slowing to a halt relative to Nebula Hub. They traversed the enormous distance to the station in just 3 minutes. The petabytes of junk data fed into the galactic defense computers allowed the Wraith Squadron to approach undetected. Major Ethan Blackwood gazed with concern at his tactical display on the Casper's bridge as they glided to a stop. "Where'd the Wraith go?" "Engine problems, sir. They informed us they wouldn't be coming along just before we went relativistic." "Excellent. Let's get started with some preparations. Gather any available personnel already stationed here and attempt to organize a weapons delivery. We'll require the assistance." "Yes, sir." Geary's assistant grinned while glancing through the roster of unassigned military personnel on Nebula Hub. A number of the listed soldiers were quite well known. At the same time, 300 Terran Marines poured out of their corvettes and onto the station. Stellar Federation defenses designed to thwart precisely this type of assault had already been neutralized by the human vanguard. The borders passed through unharmed. Nebula Hub wasn't deserted. Although its garrison of 11,000 soldiers was caught off guard and still oblivious to the Marines, they wouldn't surrender without a struggle. The true battle was still to come. Jenkins and Slater gazed at their new weapons and armor, at a loss for words. Chirp was already conducting the final inspections on his suit. Slater was the first to speak. "You think the brass have realized I'm not a combat soldier yet?" Chirp didn't even glance up. "Dunno. Reminded them lately?" "Hell no. Your toys are way better than ours." "Stop talking, you two," said Jenkins. "You're ruining the moment." Upon leaving modeled on the SAD's Invincible, the trio of soldiers found themselves temporarily assigned to Major Geary's boarding company. A wide-eyed ensign had led them to the recently established advance base, pointed out the armory, then quickly took his leave. The pair of humans hadn't budged since the transport sleds had slid open with a hiss. Human engineers were incorporating new galactic technologies into existing designs more rapidly than the Navy could implement the upgrades. The Terrans, knowing full well they could never equip every soldier with the most cutting-edge gear, had opted to gradually release new designs and models as often as possible. The CS Phantom had brought solely the newest gear, straight from R&D. In contrast, Jenkins's official powered armor was nearly 3 years old, and Slater's ERT rig hadn't received an upgrade in 5. The Market's BCPs was the newest version, developed due to recent advances in human miniaturization technology that had enabled the designers to triple the output of the onboard fusion reactor. R&D was understandably proud of this iteration. None of the extra power could be channeled into the suit's protective screens. Those had already reached their limit and would stay unchanged unless there was a breakthrough in gravitational manipulation technology. The shoulder-mounted weaponry had stayed unchanged as well. On human suits, the left pauldron housed a microbomb launcher, while the right pauldron could accommodate either a heavy weapon or specialized equipment. On aviar suits, the mount was replaced with a second microbomb launcher. Doctrine dictated that the small avians move too swiftly to aim one of the heavier cannons, and the additional weight would merely slow them down. The engineers had instead utilized the expanded energy allocation to develop the first-ever infantry cloaking module. The Perfectionist Compact had never concerned themselves with this technology, acutely conscious that a matter annihilation reactor able to sustain a continuous cloak would be glaringly visible on any respectable gravwave detector. Human combat armor didn't utilize anti-plants, however. The Market POW's miniaturized fusion reactors were capable of generating a continuous yet weak cloaking field, bending light around its wearer just enough to blur their outline and confuse an enemy soldier. A trickle-fed capacitor could also be employed to bring the field up to its full strength for 2 or 3 minutes at a time, making a slow-moving BCP completely invisible in virtually every vision-capable EM wavelength. It lent the phrase, "They'll never see us coming," a whole new meaning. Jenkins' reverie was interrupted by the Major's arrival. "Quit gawking, lads. I require your presence in the field." The trio pivoted to look at the Terran commander. He commenced his brief briefing. The recently established Scrap Squad will be taking on the responsibilities left by the Wraith's core malfunction. Their team has been assigned to provide support to a particular Chief Warrant Officer, Calloway. His group is maintaining control of Station Level 9's security office using makeshift weapons and salvaged firearms, so attempt to reach them as soon as possible. That security office is our sole connection to Lotus's fortified networks. If we lose them, the Galactics regain control of their sensors and cameras. It could even make them aware that they've got us outmatched in numbers as well. You'll have a small group of volunteers from the men we brought to maintain this position, but I can't spare all of them for you. 11 men and a grav sled packed with armor is all I can provide, and you've got to force your way through 4 enemy-controlled levels. Your HUDs should already be displaying the route. Best of luck out there. Captain Swift Wing Gliding Breeze, you're in charge of Scrap's squad. The Major started to leave, then hesitated. Oh, and Jenkins? Yes, sir. Don't fucking touch anything that might be a transmitter. Slater was in bliss. The enormous ERT's shoulder-mounted pulsar cannon ripped through the Felinar barricades. its stream of fire tearing apart both alien and cover. The wolf-like defenders had no chance of survival. They haven't learned anything since the ram, Chirp thought. We worked out how to overcome these strategies weeks ago. The squad's pair of AVR descended upon the well-fortified Felinar, their micro-bomb launchers unleashing a constant barrage of explosive pellets as they soared over the defenses. Stealth systems and covering fire had entirely concealed the bird-like unit's advance. Jenkins, move your fire team up and lock down that access way, Chirp ordered. Ramirez, cover our rear. We can't afford to lose that sled when we're only 2 floors from our goal. Balded and Streak, take a moment to recover, then join up with Jenkins. It truly was unfortunate that the AVR didn't possess the human's stamina and precision. Chirp invariably had to contend with a subtle feeling of invasion whenever a gunfight erupted. Jenkins indicated that the way ahead was clear, and Scrap's squad advanced. A Tridax peered out from its hiding spot, noticed the Terran Marines, and scurried away in fear. Scrap's squad was gracious enough to allow Chirp to divide his focus between their advancement and the actions of the other human boarders. He adjusted their route 4 times, positioning Scrap's squad to offer cover for nearby advances or to outflank areas of resistance. The Terrans made full use of their recently acquired cloaking technology to shock and intimidate the waiting defenders. Soon even the renowned Felinar discipline broke down, with frightened soldiers dropping their weapons and running from the phantom-like Terrans. Scrap's squad suffered their first casualty on Station Level 7. They had just cleared another barricade and started to advance when a Felinar, concealed under the bodies of 2 of his comrades, sprang at the squad's medic wielding a nasty-looking knife. It slid through one of the joints and struck Corporal Zhang in the armpit. As the frenzied lupine withdrew the blade for another swipe, Slater caught the assailant with a blow that sent it crashing into the bulkhead. The remainder of the squad shredded the wolf with pulsar fire. Jenkins hurriedly removed the armor plates surrounding the stab wound, but he was unable to halt the internal bleeding. Myers passed away a few minutes later. Slater handled it the worst. A pair of Marines had to bodily hold back the ERT from rushing ahead by himself to exact vengeance. "This isn't the moment, pal," Jenkins stated. "Stuff happens. Marines perish. The best thing you can do for Myers is stay focused and adhere to the mission." Slater merely grunted, yet he ceased his struggle. A quieted Scrap's squad shortly continued their progress toward Calloway's forces. "Last rifle's dry," subvocalized Lyra. "Anyone got a spare?" The remaining members of 9th Squad sent back a chorus of no's. Just a handful of them still had automatic weapons. The majority were left with their slow-firing backup pistols. They'd retreated from the fortified outer corridor 30 minutes earlier, forced back by their diminishing ammunition and the Felinar advance. There were numerous attackers. The Compact truly didn't want the humans occupying one of their command and control centers. Now they let loose sporadic bursts of fire through the doorway and hoped that the lupines assembled outside wouldn't rush in. Only 11 humans remained, far too few to prevent being overwhelmed. Zephyr, an obscenely rich entrepreneur from Venus, cautiously edged a tiny reflective mirror around the doorframe. He swore out loud as pulsar darts shredded it to pieces. "Those bastards are advancing nice and steady. They'll be near enough to get a clear view of us in a short while." Calloway grunted, his gaze fixed on an invisible schematic produced by his implants. He'd devoted the majority of the firefight to fruitlessly attempting to discover some ingenious answer to their present dilemma. Lyra let out a sigh as she examined the charge on her compact pistol. Over 100 shots remained, but the lousy little thing needed a full 20 seconds to cycle. It wouldn't be of much help if the Felinar burst through the door. The leader of 9th Squad abruptly burst into laughter. All the humans present, except for Zephyr, who was guarding the door, turned to gaze at the typically stern-faced warrant officer. "Assistance has at last shown up. It's unfortunate they destroyed the cameras, as this is going to be quite a spectacle." Zephyr glanced around the corner, then slipped through the door. "Coast is clear," he transmitted over the comnet. "Werewolves are somewhat preoccupied at the moment." Lyra crept through the entrance next, finding shelter behind one of the numerous waist-high barriers close to the door. The organized Felinar advance had disintegrated into disorder. Minor visual distortions were the sole indication of Scrap's squad's 3 AVR as they zipped around behind enemy lines, decimating unsuspecting compact forces with micro-bombs and pulsar fire. Further out, blurred humanoid shapes rushed between cover, shooting with both shoulder-mounted weapons and rifles. Even Lyra, fully cognizant of the capabilities of the latest Terran armor, struggled to follow the Terran assault as they decimated the surprised Felinar. 200 compact troops were slain in 2 minutes. As the grav sled glided around the corner and Terrans began shedding their cloaks, Lyra turned towards Calloway. "Still worried about holding the choke point, Chief?" "Not at all, Sergeant. Not at all." Krav Unblooded's final lesson lent him strength as he assumed his place in the defensive line. His battlefather had imparted the brief, customary benediction just hours earlier. "Do our bloodline proud. Repay the great debt." Somewhere in the rear, positioned among the ranks of the bloodied, his family stood prepared. His birth father and birth mother, his battle father and battle mother, along with scores of his older siblings, cousins, and their partners, gripped pulse rifles and operated heavier cannons. They would defend the Cosmic Nexus's central command until the final warrior fell. The unbloodied huddled in the front lines, compensating for their shortage of heavy weaponry and combat experience with sheer numbers and rigorous training. Each young warrior had to demonstrate his worth there before joining the seasoned fighters, and Wep was merely one among hundreds who aspired to earn their blood stripes on this day. Initially, they needed to endure, however, and the dispersed accounts arriving from various parts of the station had caused even the Felinar to dread what was approaching. Next to him, Mira Unblooded adjusted her hold on the pulse rifle she carried. The slight movement caught Wep's attention, and he flicked his ears in approval. She took note. "Take me as a mate once we've dispatched these fiends, pup. This isn't the moment for diversions." "Pup? I've known you since we scampered about in the nurseries. Yet you're always going to be a pup to me. Funny how that works." They lapsed into silence, eyes focused forward, until Wep spoke. "So you don't believe the rumors?" Lael scoffed. "Are you referring to the alleged footage of one person taking down 5 of the bloodied using knives, the rumors of spirits haunting the hallways, or the claims that the AVR have finally developed some courage and figured out how to fight?" Weep couldn't help but chuckle at the final two. "All right, nothing about the ghosts, and the idea of the small songbirds doing anything but fleeing is quite ridiculous, but the security footage is somewhat unsettling. It's meant to be the final thing. Central captured before the cameras went offline. We didn't misplace them. The saviors severed them to prevent those treacherous Tridacs from offering the feeds to the humans." "Where'd you hear that from?" "Our claw leader went around before you reached the line, provided us with a briefing. Terrans opened fire on several merchant ships without any warning, and subsequently sent hundreds of troop ships through the gate. Point defense took out as many as possible, but the devils continued to pour in." Lael's ears flattened in evident disgust as she discussed the Terrans' apparent disregard for their fighters. Weps remained alert and contemplative, based on his observations of the human artists, traders, and even the handful of warriors who had visited the Cosmic Nexus. The Terrans seemed to value life too greatly to carelessly sacrifice them against the Pride's formidable weaponry. Nevertheless, if the alternative was that the saviors were mistaken. "Claws extended, fangs exposed," called out the pack leader. The Terrans were approaching. Pulsar darts began to strike among the Felinar as Wep peered through his rifle sights, frantically attempting to locate a target. The humans were incredibly difficult to spot. Rather than the black-armored humans he'd anticipated encountering, the incoming fire appeared to originate from dozens of heavily blurred shapes. Wep shot at the Terrans, but his rounds passed harmlessly through a patch of distorted light he'd been sure contained a human. His fellow packmates had similarly poor results. A quick flash of motion drew Wep's attention, prompting the Felinar to fire a volley of pulsar darts at the ceiling. A diminutive armored form materialized and fell to the floor, its torso torn by 4 fortunate strikes. Next to him, Lael released a wild shout of joy. "Someone just got their stripes!" The pack leader must have been observing, because moments later, instructions came through for every 4th Unbloodied to direct their fire upwards. Enemy fire focused on these shooters, but it was already too late. Wep's swift thinking prevented the AVR from outflanking the defenders and swiftly overwhelming them. The Terrans continued to push forward, however, driving the compact troops back meter by meter, while remaining just beyond the Felinar's effective range. A few of the unbloodied deserted their posts, bringing disgrace and dishonor to their fading bloodline, but Wep and Lael held their ground. The 1,000-strong pack was quickly whittled down to fewer than 300. The Terrans eliminated the defenders with merciless precision, combining heavy suppressive fire with deadly accurate marksmen, while the Felinar could only manage hurried, poorly aimed shots whenever they glimpsed one of the shadowy attackers. Most missed their mark. Human figures flickered insubstantially as they darted from cover to cover, never remaining exposed long enough for the defenders to aim a shot. An advance by about 40 unbloodied was cut down well before they could reach the offensive lines. A counterattack by Terran forces reached the Felinar lines and nearly routed the entire force. When they had retreated to the last defensive positions near Central, the remaining defenders were fewer than 50 in number. Wep doubted they had managed to eliminate any Terrans. Each of the evasive attackers they'd struck had been swiftly pulled back behind the progressing front line. The surviving unbloodied mingled with the remaining bloodied, the battle-hardened veterans, taking a moment to bestow upon each young one their blood stripes and designate them as warriors. It was meant to be a moment of triumph, a celebration of a Felinar's bravery and valor, but Wep experienced only bitterness as he received the weighty cloth emblem. They lied to us, thought the Felinar. The blasted mantis lied to us. Wep had stepped past the lifeless body of his battle father, his birth mother, and 3 of his nearest siblings. He'd fought at his birth father's side as the proud warrior was slain by Terran soldiers he could scarcely make out, and Lael was gone, her shoulder destroyed by one of the terrifyingly precise human snipers. Wep had been compelled to abandon her unconscious and bleeding form as they fell back. His pack was shattered and his family was massacred. He had nothing remaining. Still, the great debt needed to be settled. Wep verified the charge on his rifle and readied himself for death. He wished the Terrans would make it swift. Past the reinforced entrance, the trio of high-ranking compact undersecretaries quarreled. "These trespassers ought to have been halted by your troops," yelled a lizard-like Murid, motioning fiercely at the Mantis military leader. "No, they ought to have been halted by the costly anti-ship defenses, which were demolished by the human artists and merchants you allowed onto the station." "They were artists. A member of my egg circle had a meal with the human from that cursed security footage. He composes poetry. Not war poetry, mind you. We didn't allow those poets on board. The majority of his books are filled with what humans refer to as flowers." Couldn't the Terrans have forged their records? Scarcely. Those of our artists and merchants who have conversed with theirs have returned full of praise. Whatever else they may be, their poets are truly poets. Are you suggesting this was an intelligence failure then? A failure on my part? Both the Mantis and the Murid turned to face the most senior undersecretary, a squid-like cephalon. Their angry bluster quickly shifted to fear. The Murid was the first to speak. No, never. We wouldn't even think of doubting your networks." "Fine. Now quit bickering and begin working out how to get us out of this situation. The Murid are obviously responsible for allowing the trial to become so uncontrolled." The lizard winced as though he had been hit, then bowed politely to the Pride's military leader. The Mantis spoke with a tentative tone. "There's no escape route. Terran troops have blocked off all 9 outer bays, disabled the railcar network, and uncovered the hideouts we'd typically be directing from. If those dogs outside can't halt the human push, we're finished. Deploy additional Felinar. The loss of hundreds or even thousands is of no consequence. We don't have any additional Felinar to dispatch. Half of the garrison was caught off guard, and the other half has been eliminated. The humans sliced through that useless crowd as if they were insignificant. What options are left then? Well, the humans did offer to let us surrender." Wep stared at his new pack leader in disbelief. "Surrender? Our pack has never suffered the shame of surrender." The Felinar twitched his ears helplessly. "We battle at the Savior's whim, and the Saviors insist on surrender. Now lower that rifle and attempt not to appear menacing." Wep obeyed, his ears flattening with fury. Curse the Saviors! Curse them for discarding everything that his pack had perished to safeguard. The Terran troops rushed ahead and Webb shut his eyes, not wanting to witness what followed. He wished that the executions would be swift and painless. The Felinar's eyes flew open in shock as one of the taller Terrans, a human, clicked restraints onto his wrists and ankles, then motioned for him to stand. He obeyed feebly, frantically attempting to understand what was going on. Were the humans escorting him away to end his life discreetly? Did they intend to injure him, compelling him to carry the disgrace of defeat for his remaining days? Was he destined to become one of their captives? Webb's thoughts were still racing when they guided him back to an improvised camp, established a few hundred meters from the blood-stained hallways. Dozens of wounded humans and AVR were arranged on stretchers, all appearing far less intimidating without their frightening powered armor. Beyond that was a small morgue, where around 20 shrouded bodies rested, and further still were even more of the injured. But none of these combatants were Terran. They were Felinar. Webb released a choked gasp and limped toward one of the injured figures. A guard lifted his weapon, ready to shoot, but another motioned for him to hold off. Their captive's movements scarcely appeared menacing. Webb quickly found himself hunched over a semi-conscious Leal, uncomfortably supporting her head with his restrained arms. She was in a daze, intoxicated by the medication the humans had administered to dull the pain, yet she still responded to his contact. "Webb," she croaked. "Did we—" "Later," he murmured, holding back tears. "Worry later. For now, just rest." Webb came back to the row of captives, his ears alert and pensive. The Mantis had misled his people about the cosmic nexus. What other falsehoods might their so-called saviors be telling? Nebula Hub's central command was packed with soldiers, including Jenkins and Chirp. Slater had opted not to participate in the last assault against the compact forces. "Hey, Chirp, this one of those things I'm not supposed to touch?" The AVR, with one wing wrapped in an armored cast, looked over at Jenkins. "Yes, Jenkins, that's a transmitter, most likely suitable for the station intercom or the official compact network. Now, move back before you—" "What are you doing?" The Marine hesitated with his finger hovering over the broadcast button. "What do you think I'm up to?" "Just being yourself, I imagine. Allow me a moment to exit the room before you finish off what remains of your career." "Thanks, Chirp. You're the best. No, I was never here. Now don't you have a major to piss off?" "All right, yes." Jenkins straightened his posture and activated the pickup. "Nebula Hub, this is Lieutenant Walsh Jenkins speaking. You may recall me from the incident where I stormed the former GCS RAM 7 years back. You might also be curious about why I'm on the PA. Well, wonder no more. Terrans just got ourselves another stick."
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.